My name is Vish Vishwanath. I'm Lee Kumki, Professor of Health Communications here at the school, as well as at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where I'm a Professor of Population Sciences. But the reason I'm here is not because I'm a professor, but because I'm also the director for the Lee Kum-Shung Center for Health and Happiness at the school. So we have been, people, some of you who have been coming here know that we have these almost near monthly seminars and webinars. Seminar cum webinar. I think we are talking about hybrid these days. Everything is hybrid. So we always have a theme around which we invite distinguished speakers. And this year, we have been focusing on loneliness, given both the public attention and attention among policymakers to this issue. As I was sharing with Dr. Hawkley, this is of both personal interest, but also it's really a public interest to everyone. But what we have been trying to do at the center also not only look at, diagnose, and elucidate the problem, social problem, which is being done in plenty, but also looking at some solutions. And so we have been inviting both a set of speakers who are in academy as well as outside academy, but who are doing this kind of work. And I'm thrilled to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Louise Hawkley. Anybody who has been working in this area will be very familiar with her name. She's a principal research scientist at the National Opinion Research Center. I don't know whether it's still called that. It's called NORC. I didn't know how many of you would recognize NORC, but those of us who have worked with public opinion and survey research are very familiar with it and look at it with great awe for the work they do. It's not your typical survey research firm. It is actually much broader than that. They do a lot of data collection, but also on really important public policy problems, and do a great job of disseminating that information and produce science on a variety of issues. And you'll see an example of that here today. Doctor, I can take the whole time. We are starting late. My apologies for that. Dr. Hawkley has a very distinguished record. I think she was in academy before she moved to NORC. She's a principal investigator on a couple of major NIH grants on aging. In addition, she mentors and collaborates with her colleagues and early stage investigators there. And she has an established track record in this area. In fact, when I was talking to a couple of other speakers and told them that you are coming, and they were delighted. Julianne was, oh, well, that's great. You're getting Louise here. So welcome. Thank you for coming. And I also want to thank everyone for coming and thank my team for all the work they have done in organizing it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been tracking things that have been popping out of the Center for Health and Happiness that really are consistent with the kind of work I do and my interests. I come to you today a little bit out of my water, you might say, because I'm a psychologist by training, and I'm not on recording. Am I better now? Yes. Okay. I am not a public health person per se. As I said, I'm a psychologist by training, which means there's been a lot of focus in my background on individual level study of this phenomenon of loneliness and what one does about it. And so I know that I have a very diverse audience. I'm going to be addressing some of that too, but I want to go a little bit further afield toward the end of the talk. So what I'm doing here, first of all, is defining terms. So a lot of people just make the mistake of equating loneliness and so being alone and being socially isolated. And clearly there are differences from a research perspective. Loneliness is a subjective feeling. It's not an objective state of being alone. Objective isolation typically refers to low levels of social contact, few interactions, few people to have interactions with, whereas loneliness is seen as a perceived mismatch between what one wants out of one's relationships and what one actually is getting. Often that's related to quality. A final distinction is that loneliness is typically not chosen. Solitude, being alone, can be chosen, and it can be quite pleasant. And I'm sure, well, you might argue about the pleasantness, but when you're sitting down to write a paper or prepare a talk, you're alone, and that's a good thing. And you may enjoy it, but it's chosen. It is not loneliness, which is not chosen, and by definition then becomes all the more distressing. The one study, it's an old study, 1976, nicely delineated what choice has to do with it. And this was a study where they randomly assigned residents of a nursing home to receive visits from college students. And the visits could be, in one group, could happen on their terms. They could decide with their visitor, I want you to come maybe Tuesday nights and Friday afternoons. The other group, they were told, your visitor will come this time and this date. At the end of 6 months, the volume of visits that the people in these groups got was the same, but only the group that chose when they got their visitors showed a reduction in loneliness. So choice is a big part of it, and I think all of us would know that choice and having autonomy is important. This plot uses data from the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, NSHAP. It's a panel study of community-dwelling older adults. Started back in 2005. We keep adding cohorts, and we've been tracking them over time. But what the plot shows you is what we see in a lot of studies, that loneliness and social isolation, measured any number of ways, is only weakly correlated. Just more evidence. These are not the same thing. So the question then is, or could be, is loneliness a sign or a symptom? And I'll take medical terminology here, where a sign is an objective, observable phenomenon that can be identified by another person. A symptom is a subjective experience that cannot be identified by anyone else. So a doctor usually diagnoses a medical condition more easily if they have both an observable sign and some kind of a report or a description of what the person's experiencing. So in this case, we have loneliness, not observable. It's a symptom. So what is it a symptom of? And why are we trying to eradicate a symptom? The symptom's telling us something, right? So loneliness from an evolutionary perspective is something that has persisted because it's adaptive. And why is it adaptive? 2 reasons, carrot and stick. Carrot, seeking bonds with others helps us ensure our own survival. We do much better with others than we do alone. The stick, striking out alone, is bad for us. It actually is painful. I'll show you that in a minute. But that same motive is good in the sense that we need somebody that has the guts to go out on their own and be the adventurer and the explorer, as long as they come back and share with the group what they've learned. So the biological underpinnings, this is vastly simplified. These are just graphics, but there are studies that have looked at the neural activation patterns related to loneliness, and they overlap significantly with the neural circuitry that underlies physical pain. There's some controversy about exactly what sections and what circumstances, but in general, there is reason to think that there is some commonality. Similarly, feeling socially connected is rewarding, and the reward circuitry in the brain is very attuned to positive things like food, like sex, like drugs, like social connection. It's rewarding. Martha Beck is a woman who suffers from schizophrenia, but she captured this really nicely. Loneliness is proof that your innate search for connection is intact. You want that. moving ahead, I want you to know how it is that we measure loneliness. So those of you who are in this area might be familiar with the UCLA Loneliness Scale, which is in its full course is a 20-item scale. And these are examples of the kinds of questions that get asked. How often do you feel isolated? Do you feel that you lack companionship? Do you feel close to people? Do you feel that you have a lot in common with those around you? And then there's a response scale that goes from never to always, roughly 1 to 4. And you create a large continuum of scores. There is a lot of discussion in the field about how you talk about loneliness as a dichotomous state. When are you lonely and when do you become not lonely and vice versa? And it isn't clear. So, and maybe we don't even want to do that, but for practical purposes, we end up doing that. But you get a continuum, and what this continuum looks like across the whole adult age range, this is using the German SEP sample, but something very similar showed up using the General Social Survey, is this wavy line where we have age going from 20 to about 100. And you see that there is a slight increase by about 30, 35, dip into 40, and increase again up until about age 60, dips again to about age 70, 75, and then goes up. In particular, I'm looking at the dark line, and it really goes up in old age. However, if you look at the dotted line and you account for or statistically hold constant the kinds of things that people experience that might be related to loneliness, and here I'm thinking in particular of things like their health status, whether they're married or not, you can essentially abolish that last rise in loneliness. So if you can maintain health and your marriage and good social relationships into old age, you're no lonelier than the young adults. Here's another thing that keeps coming up, the term epidemic. And I'm not going to argue with that term. The Surgeon General has used that term for a reason. But strictly speaking, when we look at older adults, we see no evidence of an epidemic, at least when you contrast the silent generation and the baby boom generation, because the baby boom generation, as you can see by birth year, there's no variability, and that accounts for age and survey year. I've looked at both NCHAP in blue and HRS red or pink here. There is no cohort effect. There's not really a period effect. There is an age effect in both cohorts. Always when you get older, you lose a lot of things, and those things, like loss of a spouse, loss of health, are the things that are driving loneliness. So even though I wouldn't say epidemic in the sense that the proportion of the population suffering is changed, but of course we have growing numbers of older adults, so we have a growing problem. What about in high school students? We don't have, that I'm aware of, any comparable data, but we do have cross-sectional panel data from the Monitoring the Future project, which is high school students. And what you're looking at here is from 1977 to 2012, 3 grade levels and what's happened to their loneliness during that time. Grade 12s in the dotted line, we had data from them back in 1977, and it's been constantly declining right through at least to 2009. Same thing for grade 8 and 10, we picked up in 89. And they're also showing this trend with a bit of an uptick here at the end. So this plot shows what happens to loneliness after 2012. Here you again see that decline through to 2009, but then the trajectory reverses. Everything's going up. So does that represent cohort differences or period differences? Like I say, this isn't a study like we had before. It seems unlikely there are period differences, pure and simple, because if they were, you'd expect that even the older cohorts should be showing some kind of an effect. However, it could be a period by cohort effect. Essentially, the more recent cohorts are responding differently to those same societal events, whatever they are, than older adults are. What are the data for that? Same study, same people. We're now looking at the rate of high schoolers getting together with friends. And that's a clear decline in every grade level, starting even before 2012. You can see that that's been happening since 1977 and 1989, like we had in the other plot. But it's really accelerated in this last period from 2009 on, let's say. How many of you use the American time use data? Yes. Or make the data, I don't know. So this is really a nice paper, came out just this year, Cannon and VC, or VZ, and these are 6 plots for 6 measures of types of social connectedness. So we have a measure of social isolation. These are nicely defined in this article. But you see black lines, but then red dots for join points. This is where the slope or the shift is really changing significantly. Social isolation has been increasing for quite some time, but it really took off there in 2003. So the equivalent here from 2019. 2003 to 2019, people were spending 285 minutes a day on average in isolation. 2019, it was 309. So it's about 20 minutes more isolated time in 2019. And then this plot also includes COVID, which, as you would expect, a big increase to 2020. Time spent with household family has generally been declining. And again, during pandemic times, people are hunkering down at home. They're spending more time with family. Friends' social engagement has been really going down, ignoring the 2020 blip, but it's been going down even before that. And then companionship time, very similar. If you look at that by age, and this is going to be a busy plot, there's a few things I would point out. The youngest age category, which is in blue, and you see that their time with friends has been declining for a long time. Back to 2003 to 2011 to 2019, always on the way down, on the way down. Same thing happens with engaging with others and to some degree with companionship. They spent the least time with household people. Not surprising, right? This is an age where they want their independence and they're getting out more than they are spending time with family. But look at the older adults in purple. Yes, they spend more time alone, but there hasn't really been much of a change in those other metrics other than companionship, where, in fact, if anything, they're spending more time in just companionship than are the young adults. And here's this one again. We've seen this, a reduction in in-person social interaction. But what's happening at the same time, loneliness in this dark dashed line is going up, while at the same time, social media use is going up and internet use is going up. Does look very intriguing. We don't know how this is related because we don't have you might say causal type modeling or design of this study, but it does tell us that more recent cohorts are spending less time with friends, more time with internet, social media. Note that at the individual level, people who are interacting more in person are also interacting more online. So there is that disconnect. The social media or internet use is related to loneliness, loneliness only when you've held constant their in-person interactions. The other caveat here, and this comes up a lot, and I think you've got somebody in your midst who can talk to you about this. Social media is a broad term. How are they using social media? Are they using it to connect with friends and groups where they already have relationships and they're just feeding those relationships? Or are they going into foreign land, making connections with people that they don't know? Or are they doing something totally different that we don't even understand? And how they use it is expected to make a difference in what the effect is. This is again based on NSHAP. And what we did during COVID is we asked people right then during COVID, this is between May and September of 2020. Actually, it's not. It's between September and January, February. That's another study that I was talking about. So September through to early the next year. And we asked them both how much time they were spending interacting with family in person, by phone, by messaging, that includes email, instant texting, and so on, or video call. And you know that video call was highly recommended during COVID as a substitute for this lack of time that people could have in person. Same thing was asked about how they contacted their friends. And then what we were interested in looking at was whether those virtual modes of interacting could somehow compensate for the loss of in-person contact. This is the result of a regression model, 2 of them actually, and you see that once you account for the quite significant and quite sizable effect of decreasing in-person contact on loneliness, there is no real benefit to having any of these other types of interactions. And the same thing was true for friends. So this I borrowed from Hugo Amsterdam. You can find it too at this site. Not surprisingly, apps, and I'm using that example because, again, it's a screen-mediated way of interacting, are big business, especially post-COVID. Lots of ways people are addressing loneliness in different domains: religion, family, neighborhood, friends, couples, company. All of those modes are targets for, or all of those domains are targets for apps. What we need to know in future work is whether and how different cohorts, different ages, yes, but especially cohorts, differ in their deployment of apps like this and other online and remote means of satisfying their social needs. Just as a heads up, anybody use NSHAP data here? Yay. So we're planning a new cohort, Gen X. We want to bring it in 2026. And then we will be able to ask them these questions. We expect with Gen X, we'll start seeing a significant shift in how people are divvying up their social time, and that there will be more of this virtual social time, if not by them, by virtue of their children also getting more into that stream. So we'll be able to assess, and anybody who wants to use the data would be able to assess what difference those apps make or those uses make for people's loneliness, for their health, and see if that's a cohort specific or whether it has a broader reach. Sideways move. Loneliness, we often treat it as a unitary construct, and in many ways it is. But I've also seen in US samples of young adults and older adults, samples in Beijing of students and of parents, that using that 20-item loneliness scale produces for us a 3-dimensional structure. It has at least 3 facets, and we call the first one intimate connectedness. You'll see the items listed here. And intimate connectedness, as I say here, it's the opposite of feeling the disconnection and loneliness that comes from having a few close I'd say intimate others. In our case, we validated that by looking at the difference between married and unmarried people, and married people report greater intimate connectedness. There's also a relational connectedness that refers to dyadic relationships again, typically, but they're about confidants. They're not so much about intimacy as close friends with whom you can share really important things. And in this case, we see that males are lonelier than females. That's perhaps feeding into the stereotype, but the idea here is that men tend to have more group disclosing events and not these intense face-to-face sharing experiences, right? Men have pickup basketball, women will sit over a cup of tea and spill their guts, right? That's the difference. And in collective connectedness, it goes the other way, where men have higher levels. And collective is the opposite of feeling this lack of belonging. And I really want to emphasize that word belonging in this sense. In fact, when we first did this study, we labeled that dimension belonging and subsequently came up with collective connectedness, but the idea is the same. Well, in terms of belonging, we have a robust literature that stems from work that Baumeister and Leary did back in 1995 on the fundamental need to belong. And I think we see a lot of that in today's society. And, there's a need to belong, but there's also a missingness of belonging. And so that dimension is what I find particularly relevant in today's world, particularly here in the US, but throughout. It's not the same as having a sense of belonging. Like I said, it's a need to belong, and it's having it satisfied. That's the issue. We know in this study that residential satisfaction, these were people who lived either in their home or in a resident housing, the degree to which they were satisfied with that housing circumstance was associated with less loneliness. How? By getting them to feel a greater sense of belonging, investment, engagement in their home. Kim, this is Michelle Kim from Australia, she showed that people differ in their need to belong, and it's those people who really have a high need to belong that are going to see the best bang for their buck by increasing their sense of belonging. They're going to see a larger decrease in loneliness. This one is maybe a bit of a stretch, but I thought it was very interesting. If some of you might know Shelley Gable's work with Harry Rees on capitalization. If you share good things with other people, it's good for both parties. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel more connected. It makes you happy. The same thing may be going on if you're experiencing negative things. And I don't mean sharing and bemoaning and griping together. This is a situation where we were looking at people in the health and retirement study who had experienced financial shock, income shock or wealth shock. Let's just focus on income shock. These shocks were large, 75% of your income or more. And people lost different amounts from wave to wave. The Great Recession was a bad time. A lot of people lost income and wealth. And interestingly, we found that when people lost wealth, typically, they would experience greater loneliness, wealth or income. During the Great Recession, when everybody is more likely to have this experience, they didn't show that. They actually showed a reduction in loneliness. So it's like that shared experience, being part of the group, was protective. This does bring into focus another issue for me, and that is the notion of trust. Trust is a big thing for loneliness. This paper by Rotenberg, he had done a number already in the 1990s. In this one, published in 2010, he looked at 3 age groups, early childhood, middle childhood, adulthood, and he found that trust low levels of trust or trust beliefs were related to higher loneliness, very consistently. He also did an experimental study of that in the young adults. He primed a group for distrust rather than trust, and what he observed was greater withdrawal and loneliness and less willingness to disclose. So trust is an integral part of this experience of loneliness. And it matters. In this study by Qualter, who studies in the UK, these are children from 7 to 17 years of age, but they were measured, their loneliness was measured at age 5, and then it was tracked over time. And they found 4 trajectories. This top trajectory is what they called stable, high lonely. The next one they called it moderate increasers. Then we have the moderate decreasers, and then we have these low, stable, lonely. And then they looked at what happened to those 17-year-olds in terms of some health outcomes, like how often do you see the doctor? How do you perceive your health? And it's these 2 top categories that were the ones most at risk. And what characterizes those? Low trust. This matters more generally about early intervention, if you want to call it that. Set the stage early with children, and you've got a lifetime in which you could be seeing impact. This study back in 2006, they looked at childhood isolation and loneliness, 3 different time points, and found that childhood isolation, it's actually, I would argue it's a measure of loneliness, but you can't ask a 3-year-old how lonely they are. But you do get proxy reports, and you do get a sense of consistency in how they report versus others report by the time they get to older age. Anyway, childhood isolation predicted cardiovascular risk, and it was defined like this, having 3 of the 6 factors: high blood pressure, overweight, high cholesterol, low HDL, high HbA1c, low oxygen consumption. Independent of anything they could throw at it. Independent of their adult health behaviors, their adult stress, their other childhood risk factors. That sense of childhood isolation or childhood loneliness had a very profound and lasting impact. So, not a subtle segue, but now we're going to up. We're going to go to society. And as I wrote in a chapter that was published early this year in a book, so most of you won't find it, but although it's a free book, I'll just tell you, Routledge Press, this is open publication, so you'll be able to find it. Anyway, I called it a potential marker of an unhealthy society. This won't be news to you. I see that Vivek Murthy has made the same argument, and others too. So what we see is an unhealthy country, and I'm gauging this by high levels of institutional distrust and suspicion. Anybody know a country like that? That contributes to distrust in relationships with strangers and with groups. It also exacerbates loneliness through the kinds of circumstances that are around you on a more individual level. It encourages dehumanization of others, all of which I think we're very familiar with. And the result of all of that is yet more distrust. So you set up a cycle where you're not only not trusting, but you're actually rejecting or excluding people from part of society, part of your world at least. What about country differences? We see in this study that was published just last year, I think the final printed version is 2023, but they looked at 113 countries and gave loneliness estimates for each. Again, there's some arbitrariness to how you define when somebody is lonely, but they found an agreed upon definition and they used it consistently. And so what they find is that overall, among older adults, 13 to 19% would be defined as lonely. But look at the variation. Finland as low as 6%, some of the Eastern European countries as high as 43%. Phenomenal rates. And what did they find explained those differences? Welfare systems, healthcare services and health status, and my friend, trust. This one, again, this is a recent publication, 2022. This is based just on European countries, large number of respondents, some in post-totalitarian countries, some not, even included Israel. And so what they were looking at was trust in people, trust in the system, and social engagement. And what did they find? Those Eastern European countries had higher loneliness, the post-totalitarian countries. It was linked to their levels of trust, low levels of trust, and that produced low levels of social engagement. Now, this notion of fear. Might it be the opposite of trust? Might it be kind of comparable to distrust? It's because you are afraid in some sense. This illustration is of the loneliness regulatory loop that I developed with John Cacioppo. And what you see here is perceived social isolation, which we'll call loneliness, leads to implicit hypervigilance for social threats. Why? Because there's an implicit anxiety about not feeling connected, like you might be under threat. People might not accept you. You might not be included. You might not have your social net ready for you to catch you if things were to go wrong. So that anxiety in our loop leads to, this is a psychologist speaking, right? So you get biases, attentional biases, memory biases, behavioral biases, and then it becomes a self-perpetuating process. You believe that people aren't going to be sensitive to you, aren't going to hear you, you're going to feel rejected. So what do? You put up the barriers. If you put up the barriers, people are going to be reticent to approach you. They're going to see that you're not somebody who wants to be touched. And so you get a vicious cycle of people becoming lonelier. I'll go out on a limb here. I don't mean to be political, but this was an interesting example of another way that fear can manifest. This is a cross-sectional study. I can't say anything about cause, but I think it's totally consistent for us to think that loneliness, if it represents this heightened anxiety or fear, that you're going to be afraid of all those things that are threatening to you in some way. And that could be xenophobia. It could be a reaction with right-wing authoritarianism, less tolerance for distress. That's what they found in this case. So I think of deaths of despair. They're deaths of disconnection. They're deaths of disenfranchisement, of peripheralization, if not outright exclusion and rejection. These ideologies perhaps represent active engagement and coping with feelings of disconnection, of feelings of peripheralization that arise from fear. What is the role of government? I like this quote. It's Jeremy Wright and Tracy Crouch. Tracy Crouch, I don't know if you remember, she was the first Minister for Loneliness in the UK. And they have this statement, which I think is spot on. Government can't make our friends for us. And ultimately, the challenge of creating a more connected society lies with each of us in our families, neighborhoods, and workplaces. But what government can do is help strengthen the foundations of society so that it becomes more natural and easy to chat, to share, and to trust each other. Increasing belonging and trust. Now, I haven't said much about the individual level interventions. There's a lot of them out there. And I'm sure if you take the time to go to, well, this is a bit of a plug, I suppose, but I'm on the Scientific Advisory Committee for the Foundation for Social Connection, and it has been our business to kind of collect what has been done and what are we missing and what's the evidence for and against different types of interventions. But I do want to talk about the obvious front runner here right now, which is the Surgeon General's report, where he has 6 pillars for public health, and he lays out policy, things for government to do, and for individuals. And some of you have already added to that list. I'm looking at Ian and Tyler. There may be others in the room. There are things that can be done. And here's where I will go out on a bit of a limb, and I'll be keen to hear your reaction. I've recently learned about deliberative forums. Does that mean anything to any of you? Yeah, some of you. So Stanford has a Center for Deliberative Democracy, and they have been working on identifying how we, the people, can do something about what's going on around us. And although they often talk about it in political terms, I don't think it stops there. They're also sometimes called citizen assemblies, by the way. I'm familiar with one of those in particular. It was called America in One Room. This was a study that Stanford and a couple of other universities were involved in, but NORC was the organization that recruited the people, did the surveys. And what this was is, as you see here, a gathering of over 500 voters from across the country, diverse. They wanted everything represented. So they had different genders, ages, colors, ethnicities, and political persuasions. And they brought them together, and these were their topics of discussion. DACA, Medicare for all, $15 minimum wage. You can imagine there's lots of room for dissension on those topics. These 500 plus people were in moderated sessions. They were together for a week in a hotel in Texas. And polls that were measured before and after showed that polarization went down. And the more extreme people were in their polarization to begin with, the greater the reduction. You see that Democratic participants showed a mean increase of 13 points in warmth of their feelings toward Republicans. If they were really polarized, it went up 16 points. And the same thing for Republican participants. 14-point increase in warmth. If they were really extreme, it went up 17 points. So the researchers attributed this to changes to the contact between groups because the people with the most extreme feelings were those who had had the least, if any, contact with anyone else prior to that experience. I wanted to point out that this isn't the only example, but let me just, before I do that, I was mentioning this in an earlier conversation. These citizen assemblies have been pretty active in other parts of the world. Japan apparently has hundreds of them. Ireland has had at least 2 highly successful citizen assemblies in the sense that they gathered people to discuss ending regulations on abortion and endorsing same-sex marriage. Those were their topics. They came up with solutions, supported them, and went to referendum with them. And the public overwhelmingly supported them. Never would have happened if it would have come from politicians, but it came from the citizens. And that's the power of those assemblies. You have in your midst Professor Lawrence Lessig. And he was interviewed for The Verge recently, and this is a rather lengthy quote, but the point of it is citizen assemblies have the potential to do a lot of good. In his case, he's addressing artificial intelligence. Another thing that scares me. Don't have any control over it. We feel like we're victims of what is being done to us. He's saying citizen assemblies are places where citizens confront each other. They're representative, they're large, they confront each other, they hear the other side, they see that the other side's not just a bunch of reptiles, and so on. So when they experience that, they can talk with each other, they can deliberate, they can come up with solutions or some ideas for solutions. And I like this part too. It's almost like it's in a shelter from the corrupting influence of plug in your influence of choice, in his case, AI. So he wants to see more of that. I'm going to have to jump ahead because I see we're running out of time. So I want to know this. So I think citizen assemblies are great. What would you do? And I'll leave it at that.